It started with a signature, an agreement signed thousands of miles away, the EU-US trade deal. Suddenly, the price of lobster on a restaurant menu in Paris had the power to rewrite the future of a town in Maine. For the people living along Maine's coastline, it wasn't a slight shift. It was an earthquake. This is the story of the Maine lobster coast, and how quickly it all came crashing down. One decision, one trade deal, created a domino effect that brought an entire industry to its knees. Atlantic Supreme Processors wasn't just a building, it was the town's beating heart. For 40 years, the lights were always on, the machinery always humming. Janet Marson, the plant manager, was part of the furniture. When the news of the tariffs hit, disbelief turned into dread. European buyers, their bread and butter, were pulling out. Canadian lobster, now tariff-free, flooded their market. Janet and her team tried everything, but the domestic market was saturated. The silence in the processing room was the loudest sound she'd ever heard. 300 people standing there, their faces a mixture of shock and fear. The closure of Atlantic Supreme wasn't just one business failing, it was the first and biggest domino. The ripple effect was immediate and brutal. The trucking companies, suppliers, and mechanics, their phones stopped ringing. The local diner, once packed with plant workers, was suddenly empty. Janet Marson still lives in that town, seeing the empty building every day. It's a constant reminder of the day the heart of her community just stopped beating. The generational loss, the pride, the sense of purpose, it all vanished with the flip of a switch. If Atlantic Supreme was the heart, the Northeast Fishing Cooperative was the backbone. Captain Mike Henley helped found it, believing in the co-op with every fiber of his being. It wasn't just about getting a better price for their lobster, it was about having a voice. When Atlantic Supreme went under, their biggest negotiating partner was gone. The co-op was left scrambling, trying to find new buyers for the catches of over 150 boats. The few remaining processors knew the fishermen were desperate. The prices they were offered were insulting, often below the cost of fuel and bait. The unity that had been their greatest strength began to fray. Lobstermen who had taken out loans were now facing foreclosure. Mike saw friends lose everything. The collapse of the co-op was a death blow to their collective power. It wasn't a formal bankruptcy, it just dissolved. The trust that had bound them together was replaced by a grim individual struggle for survival. Today, Mike Henley still fishes, but he goes out alone. The co-op building is boarded up, its sign faded and peeling. They were a fleet, a family. Now they're just a collection of lonely boats. Seacoast Marine Supply was the hub of the community's informal economy. Tom Brennan and Sarah Michelle, a brother and sister duo, inherited it from their father. It wasn't just a place to buy rope, traps, and bait. For generations, a fisherman's word and a handshake were as good as gold at Seacoast. The collapse of the co-op and the processors shattered that system overnight. The fishermen who owed the money suddenly had no income. Sarah Michelle started getting calls from men with broken voices, apologizing that they couldn't pay. Tom described the heartbreaking task of having to say no. The weight of carrying the debt of an entire fishing fleet became unbearable. The bankruptcy felt like a betrayal of their family's legacy. Everything was sold off, the coils of rope, the stacks of traps. The store that had been the anchor of the waterfront for nearly a century was picked apart. Tom and Sarah Michelle lost more than their store. They lost their home. When the formal economy of contracts and tariffs broke the informal economy of handshakes and honor, it took something fundamental from the community. It proved that in this new world a man's word was no longer enough. Eleanor Walsh was a banker, but here, that meant more than numbers. At Coastal Community Bank, she safeguarded her neighbors' futures. The lobster industry was the bank's cornerstone. When the industry faltered, Eleanor saw it first on paper. Defaults, once rare, began to skyrocket. Families faced foreclosure for the first time in generations. The bank itself was now in peril. Federal regulators started circling. Lending standards tightened, creating a credit desert. Eleanor had to oversee the sale to a distant corporation. The personal touch was gone, replaced by algorithms. For Eleanor, it was the final, devastating blow. Marcus Rodriguez was a visionary, or at least that's what everyone thought. His company, Atlantic Seafood Distributors, wasn't content to just be one part of the supply chain. Marcus believed in vertical integration. For a while, it was a brilliant strategy. The EU tariffs were a direct hit to the heart of his empire. His entire business model was predicated on seamless, low-cost access to the European market. Marcus tried to pivot, redirecting his massive supply chain towards the domestic US market and Asia. But it was like trying to turn a battleship on a dime. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. The debt he had taken on to build his empire was staggering. The layoffs came in waves. Thousands of people who had believed in his vision were cut loose with little to no warning. The final stage was the liquidation. The empire was dismantled piece by piece. Marcus Rodriguez, the man who had tried to conquer the lobster world, was left with nothing but debt and a cautionary tale. His story is a powerful example of the illusion of control. He thought by owning every piece of the puzzle, he was insulated from risk, but he failed to account for the one piece he could never own, the politics of international trade. The Marson family wasn't a corporation, they were a dynasty, measured not in dollars but in generations. Pemaquid Point Lobster Company had been in their family for 127 years. Young Jacob Marson was supposed to be the one to carry it on. When the big processors went down and the price of lobster cratered, the Marsons found themselves in an impossible position. Jacob and his father tried everything to pivot. They tried to start a direct-to-consumer shipping business, but the logistics were a nightmare. Every failed attempt drained their savings. The end came in the form of an offer they couldn't refuse. A large Canadian seafood conglomerate wanted their pier. The offer was just enough to pay off the bank and the debts. The day they sold the pier was, as Jacob described it, the funeral for his family's identity. An American legacy, built over a century, was erased and sold to a foreign interest. For the Marsons, it felt like their very history had been colonized. The thought of being the generation that lost it all was a burden too heavy to bear. Jacob told me he'd lie awake at night, hearing the ghosts of his ancestors walking the pier. If the individual stories are heartbreaking, the sheer scale of the collapse is staggering. Northeast Atlantic Seafood was the behemoth, the largest player on the East Coast. Their collapse wasn't a domino falling, it was the entire table being overturned. The company's business model was built on volume and export. The tariffs didn't just hurt them, it was a kill shot. The debt was the real killer. The company was a house of cards built on the assumption of stable trade. Then came the layoffs. 10,000 people across multiple states lost their jobs. The human cost was reduced to a line item in a bankruptcy filing. As Northeast Atlantic was forced to liquidate its assets, Canadian seafood companies were waiting with cash in hand. They swept in and bought up the state-of-the-art processing plants. The Maine coast was left with the wreckage, unemployed workers, shuttered businesses, and a deep sense of betrayal. The story of Northeast Atlantic Seafood is the macro version of what happened to every small fisherman and family business. The great unraveling was complete, leaving a void that may never be filled. The empty piers and silent plants along Maine's coast aren't just signs of economic loss, they are tombstones for a way of life. This was a culture built on self-reliance, community, and a deep connection to the sea. But it was dismantled by trade policy, treating lives as collateral damage. The loss runs deeper than any financial ledger could show. The story isn't over. The next chapter is already being written.